Hello readers, I'm the Average Reader and today we're reviewing the new map, Energy, Climate and the Clash of Nations, written by Daniel Yergin in 2020. So this is a book about energy geopolitics and it covers the energy situation in the United States, the Middle East, Russia, Europe and China mainly, along with also discussing new technologies and climate. And it's a book slightly over 400 pages, but it covers a lot of ground around the world. So this is a pretty good primer on energy geopolitics. So first, Yergin talks about America and specifically American shale. Thanks to the American shale revolution, which is a relatively new oil drilling method. Traditional oil, you drill down and you get a pool of oil basically that you get your oil from, while shale oil, you have something called vertical and horizontal drilling, where you dig into rocks and from that you can pull out small segments of oil. And the United States has a lot of that type of oil in places like Texas, North Dakota. And thanks to this, in the last 15-20 years or so, the United States has basically become oil independent, so it exports more than it imports. It's also part of the big three oil producers now. So number one is the USA, and then I think number two is Saudi Arabia, and number three Russia, and they produce very similar amounts of oil, way more than anyone else. The United States has also become a big player in liquefied natural gas, or LNG. As what's different with LNG from traditional natural gas is that traditional natural gas, you export that through pipelines, so it's a bit more geographically limited, while LNG, you can export that across the sea. So for example, the United States can export LNG to Europe, and the United States is among the top three LNG players also, along with Qatar and Australia. The building of different pipelines for oil is complicated by environmental activists, so although you're gonna keep having some pipelines built in the United States, it may be slowed down by environmental activists. But something that people forget is that the oil and gas energy industry in the United States is responsible for a lot of its economy and jobs. Just the oil and gas industry are responsible for 12 million jobs in the United States of America. Next, Daniel Yergin talks about Russia, and remember this book was written before Russia invaded full-on Ukraine. Russia's energy strategy to export gas into Europe is to bypass Ukraine. So traditionally it's been sending gas into Europe through Ukraine, but now it's trying to build pipelines such as Nord Stream 2 that bypass Ukraine and go through the North Sea to export gas directly to places like Germany. But in recent events, Nord Stream 2 has basically been taken offline, if I understood correctly. And something that people don't necessarily realize about Europe's energy market is that it's diverse and competitive. Russia provides a total of 9% of EU energy and about 35% of its gas. Europe also gets a lot of its gas from, for example, the North Sea, the Groningen field in the Netherlands, Norway, and also in part North Africa in Algeria. And now with the Ukraine war, you can expect EU to gradually wean themselves off more and more of Russian natural gas. Although in the short term it's complicated, in the long run, the EU could in theory be completely energy independent, away from Russia at least. But the EU goal of energy is based both on security, which means having more domestic production of energy and getting it from safer sources like the United States instead of Russia. This means, for example, producing domestic coal and nuclear energy. But there's also the climate for the EU, which makes it more susceptible to get Russian gas, but also to invest especially in green energy like wind and solar, which Germany has done a lot. And now you have Russia, which understands that it doesn't have a certain future in Europe, so instead it is pivoting towards Northeast Asia and especially to China. So more and more gas exports are proportionally going to China, but Russia is much more dependent on China than the other way around in trade. But Russia is becoming a clear strategic partner of China now in the Pacific Rim region. Next, Daniel Yergin talks about China. The United States and China, or known as the G2, they make up about 40% of the world economy. So whatever they decide that they can agree on together, that can influence a lot of things. So they could have opportunities to collaborate on a variety of things. But of course, when there's disagreement, everyone else is in pain, and you have countries in Southeast Asia trying to maneuver to not necessarily back completely the United States or China, as it's not in the economic interest of those countries to be fully on one side or the other. And you have the South China Sea now that's becoming a fault line, where you have the argument of what does an economic exclusive zone mean. So China claims the 9-line, and they claim that in their economic exclusive zone, or EEZ, that they not only have exclusive economic rights, so energy and fishing rights, which international law acknowledges, as does the United States, but also that they can determine who gets to go in and out of that region, which the USA and the UN oppose, of course, because they believe in freedom of navigation, which also includes American ships going through that region. So that could be a potential source of conflict that could escalate. And then there's the thing that when Trump rejected the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an economic deal in Asia between the United States and Asia, but that specifically excluded China, that rejection has made actually ASEAN countries, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, closer to China now, economically. And China is the biggest world energy consumer. They make up about 25% of energy consumption. They're also heavily reliant on coal, about 60% of their energy. And they are also becoming an increasing consumer of oil. They consume about, at this time, about 2020, 70% of world oil imports. They're the biggest customer in the Persian Gulf, which passes through the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. So then you have something that's known as the Malacca dilemma, that if China would act in any way towards Taiwan militarily, then you could have the USA maybe block off the Strait of Malacca, which would be deadly for China economically. So the South China Sea is of strong economic and geopolitical security importance to China. Also, China is extremely dependent on trade, about 40% of their GDP. 7 of the top 10 container ports are located in China. Next, Daniel Yergin talks about the Middle East, and he gives a brief history also of the region in recent terms. But he also talks about the emerging Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Iran that's backing a bunch of Shiite militias around the Middle East, such as in Yemen, or in Iraq, or in Syria, or in Lebanon, or even backing Hamas in Gaza. Now, with the rising gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, that has allowed Israel in recent years to become gas independent. And in recent years, OPEC and OPEC Plus has struggled to get agreement on how much these countries are gonna produce because of the rise of shale. And American oil, very different from the rest of the world, is actually privately owned, while most countries like OPEC or Russia, the energy sectors are basically controlled by the states. So we've had different negotiations in OPEC where initially they didn't get a deal, so then they let prices control themselves in the energy markets, but later they got a deal anyways. And then with COVID, you had a plunge in oil demand, which led to a plunge in prices, with Trump coming along and pressurizing Saudi Arabia to make a deal with Russia so they can cut back production to keep oil prices from not falling too much, because oil prices initially in COVID fell down as low as single digits, which is extremely low, because relatively recently the standard oil price was $100 and it went all the way down to single digits. Of course, now it has rebounded a little bit. And recently, a few years ago, Qatar was diplomatically isolated by the UAE and Saudi Arabia for moving too close to Iran, but this provided an opportunity to Turkey, which has now a lot of soldiers there. Countries in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia or the UAE are building up large sovereign wealth funds worth hundreds of billions of dollars, investing in different things, and they're trying to reform their economies because they expect that you're gonna have peak demand in oil and oil demand is gonna decrease over time. So they hope that in the coming decades they will no longer be dependent on oil. But they're using that oil money to invest in their economy, to develop, for example, the private sector. And Saudi Arabia has become more reformed and open since the ascendancy of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and also King Salman. Next section is about technology, and you're having the rise of electric cars and also driverless cars. Yergin also talks about car hailing, where you have the rise of things like Didi or Uber, where you order a ride, ignore the taxi, and you don't have to drive yourself. But of course, demand for that has fallen in recent years, and although driverless cars exist now, they're not fully autonomous, and people will of course be skeptical about them and worried about what might happen with hacking and how different potential accident scenarios would be handled. And Yergin basically argues you will not have a full transition in cars to electric cars by 2050. It will make up a big percentage of car sales, but there will still be gasoline cars around. The final section Daniel Yergin talks about is climate, and here he talks about that we are actually transitioning to more green energy like wind and solar, partially because solar production costs have declined a lot. And the EU has made the climate their top priority now, and there's also this culture of climate care among millennials. And the EU is going to accelerate the green transition through things like new regulation, but also subsidies into green energy. And now you have oil and gas companies that are more emphasizing gas than oil. As gas, although it emits carbon, it emits way less carbon than oil. But Yergin argues you're not going to have a full energy transition. Fossil fuels are still relevant, especially in the third world, as there they still have to worry about a lot of poverty, which they want to get out of through economic growth. And they also have to worry about indoor pollution that kills 4 million people a year. These issues are especially the case for a place like India, for example, where you have Modi who wants economic growth, but also thinks about the green energy transition a bit, but not in the same terms as the more developed West, which has a heavy focus on green energy. Fossil fuels are still gonna be very important in the developing world. And that's the book. So how would I rate the new map? I would give it a 9 out of 10. This is a very nuanced read on energy politics, which acknowledges both the importance of oil and gas and shale, but also talks about climate, and it looks at different dynamics around the world, and it doesn't make any strong statements of this or this will happen. It lays out many possible scenarios, different degrees of the energy transition that we can have, and also potential conflict issues that we may have between countries, which are partially related to energy matters. And there are some minor mistakes I noticed in this book, but nothing really that takes away from the greatness of the geopolitical analysis in this book about energy. So yes, I would wholeheartedly recommend the new map if you're interested in energy geopolitics. And if you want to learn more about the coming Sino-American conflict, then you can watch my book review of The Avoidable War. Otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see readers next time.